Rules of engagement, Riyadh and Tehran at loggerheads after an Iranian tanker is hit and Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure suffers a crippling blow. Hello, I'm Nathan King, sitting in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Hello again. Arch foes Saudi Arabia and Iran are playing the blame game. Riyadh says Tehran is behind last month's attacks on its oil plants, while a senior member of Iran's parliament has accused the US, Israel and Saudi Arabia of attacking an oil tanker. The two regional rivals locked in a standoff, raising fears of an all-out war. Earlier this month, Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan travelled to Riyadh and Tehran to try and mediate, and Russian President Vladimir Putin touched down too in the Saudi capital, his first trip there in 12 years, a sign perhaps of a new power broker in the Middle East. To discuss Saudi-Iranian rivalry and its impact on the region, let's bring in our panel. Ahmed Al-Ibrahim joins us from Riyadh. He's a political and security analyst. Anton Fedyashin joins us here in Washington. He teaches Russian and European history at American University. And joining us from Tehran, Mostafa Khoshcheshm. He is a political analyst, and Mike Lyons joins us here in New York. He's a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point. Welcome all of you to the show. Ahmed, I want to start off by actually playing a little bit of Mohammed bin Salman about the threats to the region and get your reaction off the back.
If the world does not take a strong and firm action to deter Iran, we will see further escalations that will threaten world interests. Oil supplies will be disrupted, and oil prices will jump to unimaginably high numbers that we haven't seen in our lifetimes.
So, Ahmed Al-Ibrahim in Riyadh, what did the Crown Prince mean by that? What is the current policy towards Tehran? Is it a hot peace, a Cold War?
Well, I think what he said on the interview, basically, it's a repetitive of what he said 2 years ago about Iran not being a key player in the region and how the world community needs to focus on Iran and try to isolate Iran as much as possible, whether it's from an economic point of view or political point of view. And today we see that whatever he said 2 years ago, it's actually fact on the ground, that Iran has taken such a moron move in order to disrupt the oil flow of, of the whole world and cut the production by 50%. So definitely, if you want to frame it, it's on a Cold War. Yes, Iran is in a Cold War with their neighbors and with the world. And I think MBS is looking for the international community in order to find a solution to overcome this problem. Whether it's more sanction, it is harder sanction on Iran by cutting oil supplies to them in Iraq or in Turkey.
Can I just follow up with you on that, Ahmed? Maximum pressure campaign from the US has been going on quite a long time now. A lot of sanctions, even nearly a war, but it hasn't seemed to work. So is just Riyadh's answer more of the same?
Well, I agree with you, actually. Iran has been adopted and molded themselves to these kind of sanction. I mean, what a sanction can happen when you still can export your oil through Iraq and Turkey? We need harsher sanction. We need more the sanction that it was applied on Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 1995, no-fly zones. They cannot actually get anything into ports. These kind of sanction, maybe it's going to work in the future, but on the current sanction, I agree with you, this is not going to work. So they need to find a way in order to the Iranian regime to come to the international community and stop this nonsense. We are not interested in any kind of war or any kind of escalation, but they took the stick of escalation, and they are trying to get the whole region, pull the whole region in a war that it's not necessary, because the regime only fume itself from these kind of disruptive problems in the region.
Mostafa, in Tehran, I want to put this to you. There was a lot of diplomacy at the United Nations recently where there was almost a call, it seems, between President Hassan Rouhani and the US president. There was a hope of a breakthrough. Is it now back to just the standoff that we've seen over the last few months between Tehran and Riyadh?
Hello, and thanks for having me. Well, let me just explain a little bit about what's happening in the region right now. Let's remember that the region is on fire because of the wrong U.S. policies and strategy of the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. They pushed the region, including the Arab states like Saudi Arabia, and provoked them into confrontation with Iran. But now that everyone should pay the costs for this wrong policy and strategy that has already failed, as you just mentioned, and my colleague in Saudi Arabia said the sanctions have failed, they do not work. If pushing Tehran to negotiation with Washington is the main objective, they have already failed. And now that everyone should pay the costs, the U.S. says it would not go into war with Iran for Saudi Arabia. They have left the Saudis actually similar to what they have been doing to the Kurds in northern Syria. And there have been reports that they are even transferring their CENTCOM from Doha to South Carolina in order to avoid any kind of damage on the U.S. Army. Now, it's very easily understood that after being provoked by the United States, the Saudis started adventurism in the region. According to Joe Biden, when he was vice president of the United States, it was the Saudis, Qatar, and Turkey that pushed the region, especially Syria and Iraq, into proxy warfare and war of militancy. There have been so many acknowledgments by former and present U.S. officials who have acknowledged the same. And also, it was Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, who warned to take the war to Tehran less than 2 years ago. And then we witnessed two terrorist attacks on the Iranian parliament and the shrine of Imam Khomeini. So we could see also that Iranian tankers have come under attack near Saudi Arabia on two separate occasions.
Mike Lyons, I'd like you to respond to a bit of that, because obviously from Washington this looks a little bit different. In fact, we've seen the US announce up to 2,000 troops heading to Saudi Arabia. That's on top of all the other forces that moved into the region. Obviously, Washington very spooked by the attack on Saudi Arabia's oil facilities and how much was destroyed, regardless of who did them. What is the situation in terms of Washington and Riyadh and this maximum pressure campaign?
Well, the situation in Saudi Arabia and that attack in particular on the Aramco facility did thrust the United States military to kind of rethink the air defense platforms it had there, and that's why the air defense soldiers are going to Saudi Arabia. More battalions of Patriot missiles, as well as the THAAD, the high-altitude missiles, because of concerns of Iranian capability of medium and long-range missile systems that could hit Saudi Arabia there. The creativity of that attack, the kind of attack it was with specific drones that were targeted one specific building with low tech but high enough grade to make it and to achieve their targets. And I think the United States is going to align itself and continue to align itself when Saudi Arabia asks for help, and that's what happened here. And we haven't seen that since 29 years ago, when larger numbers of U.S. troops were deployed to Saudi Arabia in order to defend the kingdom against what was Saddam Hussein at the time, rolling tanks through the desert. But the kind of troops that we're sending are not offensive in operation. They are clearly defensive weapon platforms that are going to help and enhance Saudi Arabia. And I don't see them staying there very long.
I just want to follow up, because the world was surprised by the attack on the oil installations, despite all the billions of dollars that Saudi Arabia has spent largely on U.S. technology and hardware. It took everyone by surprise. Was this a blow to not just Riyadh's reputation to defend itself, but also the U.S. protection in the region?
Well, in classic form, the lack of creativity on the defense is what the attacker often uses to do the first kind of step when they make this kind of attack. And that's what happened here. Nobody anticipated this kind of attack, the multiple different drones that were launched and these low-level cruise missiles. And so I think that's where now the defense is going to have to pivot to. I mean, no question, it does look like, given what Saudi Arabia does spend on their defense, they weren't ready for it. But now I think you're going to see much more creativity on the defense and recognizing, like what happens in Israel, for example, the Iron Dome platform. They're going to have to come up with better systems in order to make sure that they can protect the kind of threats that are going to come from the air.
Anton, I guess in Riyadh and Iran traded accusations about sinking of tankers and attacking tankers and the like. There is an international concern about the world's oil supplies, of course, and we've seen more of an insertion of Russia. We mentioned Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Riyadh. Let's just play a clip of him, and I want to get your reaction about how Russia is involved in this off the bat.
If anyone believes that acts such as the seizing of tankers or strikes against oil infrastructure could in any way affect the cooperation between Russia and our Arab friends, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or the strikes could affect or destroy our interaction in the context of OPEC+, they are very wrong.
Yeah, Anton, we saw Putin's first visit, I think, in 12 years to Riyadh. You can't look at the Middle East in a vacuum when you see what's happening in Syria. What's going on here? I thought it was Riyadh and the US in lockstep, but that's not always the case, is it?
Well, that used to be the case. It is still, for the most part, the case. But what the Russians are doing is that they have been playing a very intelligent diplomatic game. They have been engaging with everyone without exception in the Middle East. Russia has, for example, a no-visa, free travel regime both with Israel and with the United Arab Emirates. Putin was just not only in Riyadh, but also in Abu Dhabi with visits, and the red carpets were rolled out. Russia has become a power broker in the Middle East. Its policy towards all of the countries in the region is more predictable, it's more balanced, and it's a lot more nuanced than the United States policy has been. Russia hasn't been sort of engaging itself into very complex situations in the Middle East with a very binary interpretation of things, good guys, bad guys, and then you go in guns blazing. The Russians have been very carefully playing all sides, and they've been doing that in Syria also, and we see that to this day. So the Russians have been taking advantage of their position as relative outsiders in the Middle East, because during the 1990s and the post-Soviet period, Russia was simply irrelevant in the greater region, and now that it's come in, it hasn't come in on anyone's side. And in the interview that you had just showed a clip from, Putin actually made a very important statement. He clearly stated that Russia will not be friends against any other country in the Middle East. And so far, they've played their cards very well.
Interesting. Mustafa, I want to go back to you in Tehran, because there's been a lot of talk about defensive measures here and offensive measures, but very little talk about diplomacy. Where do we go from here? Because as we know, the Iran nuclear deal was unilaterally abandoned by the US. European partners are trying to revive that. Tehran is upping its enrichment of uranium, pulling it strategically step by step. Is there any hope for some sort of diplomatic breakthrough here when we're seeing more troops coming to the region?
Well, let me talk about the region first. Iran has offered, as you know, several proposals to resolve the differences between Iran and the regional states, the last one being establishment of regional forum for dialogue, especially to resolve the differences between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as well as the Hormuz Peace Initiative that was raised by President Rouhani at the UN General Assembly a few weeks ago.
Yeah, that requires the withdrawal of all US forces from the region, right?
And it was received a cold welcome, both from, but it didn't receive a warm welcome from Saudi Arabia or the United States and its Arab allies. But when it comes to Iran, Saudi Arabia, I believe the Saudis are feeling the burden, and they have come to realize the limits of their power and vulnerabilities, and they will be forced to eventually de-escalate the situation, similar to what the UAE did a few months ago. And they came to Tehran and they asked Tehran for de-escalation, and Iran told them that if they want de-escalation, then they should stop supporting the United States Army against Iran. Let's remember that the Saudis were the ones that helped the United States enforce the sanctions on Iranian crude supply by making up Iran's lost share in the market. When it comes to the United States, well, it's interesting that according to Obama, as well as according to the architect of the sanctions against Iran, both have stressed that the maximum pressure campaign and the sanctions policy has a limited period for producing maximum efficiency. That's 1.5 to 2 years since they are reinstated on Iran. We are now 1.5 years, almost 1.5 years after President Trump reinstated the sanctions against Tehran. Now, they know pretty well that if they fail to push Tehran to the negotiation in the next 1 or 2 months, then they would lose the sanctions weapon for good or for the next 1 or 2 decades, because a country that can cope with the situation with these sanctions could continue the same kind of policy and reduce the impacts of the sanctions to certain levels. And Iran has already done that. It has already contained the inflation rates as well as dollar exchange rates. So I believe Macron and Europeans came to realize this very fact, like President Obama, that there is a period and limit for enforcing the sanctions as a policy. But Donald Trump was adamant to understanding the experts' warnings that he needs to shift the strategy. I believe Donald Trump will eventually come to realize that in the next few months and change his strategy and policy towards Iran by softening tone and easing parts of the sanctions, as we already could see some signs appearing, through Donald Trump's moves, very recent moves.
Ahmed, I just wanted you to follow up on that. U.S. President Donald Trump has actually offered to talk directly with Hassan Rouhani from Tehran. There was even talk of some sort of resumption of talks if you included U.S. concerns about Iranian behavior in the region and its missile capability in return for perhaps a freezing of the sanctions. Would Riyadh welcome an open bilateral conversation between U.S. President Trump and Hassan Rouhani?
I don't think there is a problem. Yes, of course they will support, because the last thing we would like to have a war with somebody who actually they don't care about war or economy, or their people at a poverty level, or their interest rate is high, or they support militias in Iraq and in Syria and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and actually the Houthis in Yemen. So this malicious government that's sitting in Iran, we would like them to grow up and come to a full-fledged government. As MBS said before, we don't need any militias in the region. So, for example, if Lebanon, they have their own government, why there is something called Hezbollah, supported by Persians, by Iran, by a different race actually coming as an advanced battalion. Also the same thing with the Houthis. This kind of ideology that Iran is trying to export through their revolution, through the thing that they are playing on the Shiism and the Sunni, this needs to stop. So if they grow up and they come to the international community and stop killing America in their embassies and burning embassies and start giving dignity to their own people and put the level of economy high rather than shooting missiles. I mean, it gave flat out their attack on Iranian attack that your guest is proud of, that happened in Saudi Arabia, and he thinks that Saudi Arabia is vulnerable to that attack. That shows how the government is a moron government. It's a militia. It's terrorism. They export terrorism that this region is done with. So if America, they have an access to this kind of militia to come down or to grow up and be accepted in the international community, yes, for whatever reason is accepted.
Ahmed, obviously, Mike, we're having trading bars between Riyadh and Tehran about various activities in the Middle East and who's to blame for what. And we understand that the tensions are high. But does the US have a problem here in terms of backing its Saudi ally? MBS has come under a lot of criticism. The murder of journalist Khashoggi, the grinding war in Yemen and the humanitarian consequences there, the opposition of the US Congress to a lot of what's going on, and even threats of holding up arms sales, which have never really happened with Saudi Arabia under this administration.
No, I don't think so. First of all, I think this president is more transactional than the previous administration, and I think he looks at things more from a business perspective. You know, the reason why he says that we've got soldiers going to the kingdom and the kingdom will pay for it, I don't agree with that philosophy. I don't believe U.S. soldiers should be deployed unless for cases of U.S. national security. But having said that, I do think that the president will continue to support Saudi Arabia based on just the long-standing United States relationship with the country and understanding that you know, we're not going to change the way Saudi Arabia does business and what they're doing. The Carter Doctrine, for example, is no longer in effect. The U.S. enjoys this energy independence, and I think that's probably why you're seeing some pushback from Congress and others that are saying, hey, look, we don't have to be as supportive of that region at this point, maybe why the president's trying to get out of Syria at this point as well, but we don't have the same interest. Now our interest has got to be more aligned towards what these countries are actually doing.
Anton, part of the whole JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, was sort of an effort, and then this was talked about a lot by the countries involved, was to try and bring some sort of regional stability and open up talks between Riyadh and Iran about stepping back and let the region do it. That obviously hasn't happened. Where is the international community now, especially because we have obviously the signatures of this nuclear deal wanting to keep it going, but the economic benefits are not flowing to Tehran. What's the next step here?
Well, the next step is to hope that the United States will come back to the table and get back into the deal, but that's not likely to happen as long as Donald Trump is president.
But it nearly did happen. I mean, you know, and we see this with Trump quite a bit, where he's like, takes a maximalist position, but actually if you look at what he does, he tends to drift very much towards a sort of conciliatory tone, especially if you can have that meeting at the top where things get decided.
Well, that's right, but I don't see that his moving towards that conciliatory tone with Iran so far. But again, that he's so unpredictable that may change. I think what's actually happening is that there's a growing trend towards regionalization in global geopolitics in general, because with the United States having sort of racked up as many mistakes as it has with its direct involvement in the Middle East over the past 20 years, the countries in the region are looking to sort of try to solve their problems through other actors, and Russia is becoming one of them, although whether that's actually going to work is still unclear. But it seems to be working in Syria so far, although it's, again, a little too early to tell what it will actually produce.
Yeah, I think you're right, because there's been a lot of meetings between Moscow and other countries in
Ankara and Tehran, as a matter of fact, the three most important players when it comes to the issue of Syria. And what doesn't often get reported in Western news these days is that the constitutional meetings are about to start happening either in late October or early November. They will be negotiating basically a path forward for Syria, and this will be under UN supervision. So this is the perfect example of the Middle Eastern powers at least trying to come together with the U.S. and with Russia, and most importantly, of course, with the different factions on the ground in Syria to try and negotiate a step forward. If it works, and if it's not undermined by any outside powers, we may see a blueprint for how to solve so many of the problems that bedevil the Middle East. So let's see what Moscow delivers, and if it can.
Mike's nodding there because, you know, there are other players involved. I just want to refer to Syria because obviously we can't ignore the news coming out of Syria this week. The pullback of US troops in northern Syria and the pictures that we've seen of their once Kurdish allies being attacked by Turkey, has that hit US prestige when it comes to saying our word is our bond and we will back people through thick and thin? Because obviously this does have dynamics for the wider region, including Riyadh and Tehran.
I think the president did that for his U.S. audience and his U.S. base as he's running a political campaign now to look for re-election next year. He ran on the promise that he would take the United States out of endless wars. The fact that we put troops inside of Syria and aligned them with an enemy of the Turks was not a good idea from the very beginning, and without any thought about how we were going to extract them. I don't like, again, the idea of 29 or 30 soldiers being fundamentally a tripwire. And Turkey is a NATO ally, and that relationship has to be repaired. So I think the president, again, transactional as he is, was tired of the status quo. decides to remove the troops, and now things are moving faster in certain directions. The question is whether or not ISIS reconstitutes. I think that's its biggest political risk. If ISIS reconstitutes by next summer and is taking land and is doing things that they were doing 8 years ago, the president's in big trouble.
Mustafa, what are the lessons that Tehran is learning from this week's actions? And you know, the silver lining potentially is the US president being committed to pulling back from the Middle East. Do you see any positive outcomes?
Well, there could be some positive outcomes in northern Syria before this agreement, suspicious agreement with Turkey, because it's not going to resolve the Kurdish issue. Actually, it is just moving clashes and the war from the border to 20 miles down on Syrian soil. In other words, the clashes are not going to end. They would subside probably, they would reduce, but the Kurds will still be under attack by the Turkey-backed militants. Let's remember that the Free Syrian Army, that was called once by the Europeans and Americans as armed opposition of Syria, now they are being called as terrorists after they have been killing the Kurds. I believe Erdogan means to open up a safe zone in order to resettle millions of refugees from Turkey to northern Syria, and then they will be policed by the same militants who would shield, who would use these people, these refugees, as their shield to continue attacks on the Kurds. The Kurds should, nobody wants to see them getting killed, but this is not going to end the problem of the Kurds. The Kurds should have been smarter in order to stay loyal to the deal with the Syrian government, to deliver control of these lands to the Syrian army and Russia in order to resolve the differences and the war. But for the time being, I believe it's not going to solve the problems.
Okay, I just want to get a quick reaction and last word to Ahmed in Riyadh. Is Riyadh worried about what's been happening in northern Syria and the effect that it could have on US commitment to its allies throughout the Middle East? Because essentially this is not the best news for Riyadh in Syria, correct?
Absolutely. I mean, we yet to know what's going to happen, and unfortunately in Syria and pulling out the troop, but there is a game that we are early to know what is the game. But I think Donald Trump has put Turkey, Iran, and Russia in a swamp that it's not easy for them. They're going to get out of it. Just the fact they pulled up the troop to let the Turks go in Syria, and the Iranians and the Russians are there on the ground, there's something going to be outcome of that. But just to come off Saudi Arabia and bilateral relationship with America, even with President Putin coming to the region, to Saudi Arabia, the government signed about 20 memorandums, MOUs. None of them actually talks about weapon. This is something exclusive to the United States. This is something that this government here in Saudi Arabia would like to support their allies in America. So this is something that shows that yes, we are opening to Russia. There's a lot of people in the market also to get Putin to understand what is happening on the ground when he's supporting actually Iran and supporting the other nations that Saudi Arabia has a conflict with. So it just have a clear political picture in the region. America is still an ally, but we always question, who do they support really in the region?
Thank you, Ahmed in Riyadh, and thank you, Mustafa, obviously in Tehran as well, and my guests in New York and here in the studio. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.